All right, hello, welcome. I'm really excited to have you all here today for the first of our three-part session on the legal basics for startups and entrepreneurs. My name is John Milgram. I am the founder of Milgram and Dascom, which puts me in the unique position of both having been a founder myself, but also providing legal services to a lot of startups. So I empathize with a lot of the struggle that a lot of you guys are going through. Our firm is now about 5 years old. I've had the luxury of presenting at Denver Startup Week for this will be my 6th year. Really excited to be here. Get a lot of energy from you guys and from working with startups in general. And I want to make sure that these next couple sessions that our firm is putting on are as valuable for you as possible. So we'll make sure at the end to stop and have time for questions. But please don't hesitate to jot questions down or ask any questions. There are no dumb questions, especially when it comes to law. I would also encourage you guys all, if you can, to move forward. There's going to be some small type on this screen, which is going to be pretty essential for some of the decisions you might be making as founders. So if you're having trouble seeing, please don't be shy. Come forward. We don't bite. I put on deodorant this morning. We're ready to rock and roll. Yeah, I'm John Milgram. This is Madison Shaner. We are colleagues at Milgram and Dascom. Stoked to be here. We're going to talk to you today about entity formation, which is the first of essentially 4 buckets that I usually talk about when talking to startups. We're only going to talk about 3 of those buckets today because the 4th bucket is regulatory, and that's really, really industry specific. So to put on a one-size-fits-all presentation for that would be difficult. We're going to go over quite a bit of subject matter today that's very broad, so consider this to be a 101, but once again, we'll reserve time at the end for questions and want this to be as valuable for you all as possible. I would be remiss not to thank our sponsors, and I would also get in trouble. So thank you to Amazon, Capital One, Dell, the Denver Business Journal, the Downtown Denver Partnership, Public Works, and Battery 621. Use these hashtags for things if you're out there live tweeting this event. And yeah, let's dive in. So the other 2 portions of this 3-part series will be third-party contracts. We will have Jason Fisher and Amanda coming and talking to you about that. They're fantastic and have really good insights into this because one works on the transactional side and the other works on the litigation side. So you get to kind of see both sides of how a contract might be interpreted and how it might be enforced. Strongly recommend that. And then lastly, putting IP into HIP. I'll be talking about IP protections, and it'll be a very hip presentation with my thick-rimmed glasses. Sponsors, again, they're great. Thank you. More sponsors. Great folks. Good stuff. Oh, and if you scan that QR code for Green Spoon and Martyr, you can win all sorts of good stuff. Tickets, dinners. Disclaimer. Wouldn't be a legal presentation without disclaimers. We are not your lawyers unless you specifically hire us to be your lawyers. So until then, this is an educational presentation, and there's no attorney-client privilege. There's no relationship between us at this juncture. And with that, we're going to dive in. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the sort of overview of entity types. Then Maddie's going to present on LLCs. And this should say corporations. But I'll talk to you about corporations. So essentially, there's 4 types of entities. Sole proprietorships, partnerships, limited liability companies, LLCs, and corporations. There are others, but this is what we're going to talk about today, and these are the predominant ones that you should be thinking about. And really, what you should be thinking about are limited liability companies and, once again, pretend this says corporations. Because truthfully, at the end of today, I'm hoping that every one of you walks out of here and says, we should not be a sole proprietorship, and we should not be a partnership, because the liability associated with that is insane, and it's very easy to start a company. So do yourself a favor and do that. And then when deciding between LLCs and corporations, you really want to be thinking about the long term and setting yourself up for success. So making these decisions at the onset about appropriate entity structure is really critical to the long-term success of your company. We'll talk about the considerations that you should be making when deciding between an LLC and a corporation. And we'll also talk about some of the tax implications and other sort of benefits you can experience by making certain decisions at the onset of your startup. Maddie and I were both teachers before becoming lawyers, and so we always like to have two things. One is a goal outcome of our lesson, and two is an agenda. So attendees will be able to, that's a ABAT, explain why it's important to have an entity, be able to form your own LLC by the end of this presentation, understand liability protection, and understand considerations when electing between an LLC and a corporation and tax elections, and have a base knowledge of the Corporate Transparency Act, which is going into effect in just a few short months. And with that, I will pass it to Maddie to talk about sole proprietorships and general partnerships and LLCs.
Thanks, John. So sole proprietorships and general partnerships, as John mentioned, are really easy to start. They are the default business entity because they aren't actually entities. It just means you went out and started a business. The main difference between a sole proprietorship and a general partnership is that a sole proprietorship means you're on your own. General partnership means there is one or more people with you. You don't have to file documents. You just kind of say, I'm starting a business, which makes this really risky because it's super easy to do. There's no legal distinction between you and your entity because you don't have an entity, which means there's no personal liability protection if something goes wrong. If you, for instance, get in a car accident while you are doing something for your business, well, you might be liable for that. If you accidentally scrape an image from the internet without properly licensing or attributing that image, you can be liable for that. And in the copyright space, which John will talk about this afternoon, that can mean damages upwards of $150,000 a pop. So danger, thin ice, stay away from this. If you don't have an entity coming in here today, we really, really hope that you will leave here today and form one. So if John and I start a lemonade stand, don't file any documents, run it out of our personal bank accounts, what's our entity structure? We are, in fact, a general partnership. I maybe have a little too much lemonade one day and run into another car on my way to set up a second location for our business. Who's liable for the damages? Both of us. This is, again, a general partnership, if not structured properly, is even riskier than a sole proprietorship because not only am I liable for what I do, I'm liable for what John does, and vice versa. We are jointly and severally liable for things done in connection with our business. So we want to avoid this. Which brings us to a limited liability company. These are flexible entity types that give you a lot of the same freedoms as a sole proprietorship or a general partnership, but they also, if operated correctly, give you liability protection. They do require an organizational document be filed with the Secretary of State. That's called an Articles of Organization. They also require an operating agreement, which we'll talk about in a minute. They do have a flexible structure though, and unless you make a specific tax election, they are pass-through taxation. So they are not taxed at the entity level. All of that income gets passed through to the members who are the owners of the company. If you maintain corporate formalities, though, you have limited personal liability. You are able to say, well, I'm doing something for my business, wasn't me personally, the business is liable. So your house, your car, your retirement accounts, your kids' college accounts, those are all going to be much more protected if you operate them correctly. We'll talk about corporations later. So in Colorado, it's really easy to form an LLC. Really easy. Our Secretary of State's website is one of the easiest to use that I've ever encountered. They walk you through every step. These slides will be linked later, but you'll go to the Secretary of State's website. And in order to form your entity, you want to do a couple of things. First, run a name availability search. Make sure your exact name is available. Then you're gonna, especially if you're consumer facing, run a search in the broader business database. That'll tell you if there's a name that's going to be confusingly similar to yours. Again, check out John's IP session later today for more there. But say the name Nike LLC is available in the state of Colorado. I can form Nike LLC. Might I, if I am operating a consumer-facing business run into some trouble when Nike gets wind of the fact that I'm calling my company Nike? Yeah, probably. So when you're forming your entity, there are a couple of pitfalls. The Secretary of State will walk you through pretty much everything. A couple of pitfalls you want to watch out for, though. The first, make sure you are informing consumers that you are a limited liability company. So that's putting LLC or LTD in your name. The second is to select a manager-managed entity. So LLCs are owned by their members. They can be managed by their members. But first, we want to continue to create that separation between you and your business. So you as a member can also be a manager. Great. But it creates a separation. It also allows you to bring in members who have no management rights. So if you want to give membership to investors, you can do that without making them able to manage your entity. You can also bring in a manager who isn't a member. So select a manager-managed entity. After this is finished, you're going to go to the IRS's website. You're going to get something called an EIN, an employer identification number. This is the social security number for your business. What this does is you use this for your W-9s, your W-2s. Every time you're conducting business, you need to give out an identification number for tax purposes. That's what you're going to give out. You're also going to use it to open a bank account, which brings us to the next slide. So maintaining liability protection. When you have either an LLC or a corporation, but specifically with an LLC, because that's what we're talking about right now, we want to maintain the liability protection by enforcing that separation between yourself and your business. The number one way to do this is to keep your business and your personal finances separate. So you're going to use that EIN that you got from the IRS. You're going to go to your bank. You're going to open a bank account. You're going to open a credit card if you want. You are going to run all of your business expenses through those accounts. You are going to run only your business expenses through those accounts. You are not going to commingle your personal and your business finances. That is the number one way people mess up and lose their liability protection. Second thing you're going to do is keep written records. Yes, it is time intensive, but the more detailed your records are, the more timely your records are, the easier it is to maintain that liability protection. So if John and I, we've decided lemonade stand, not for us. We are going to open a banana stand, though, because there is always money in the banana stand. We form an LLC. We go to the Secretary of State's website, form our LLC. We run it out of a business bank account. One day, John has too many banana splits. Gets a little sugared up. He's on the way to set up our second location, and he runs into a car. Who's liable for the damages? I think our business name when we last did this was John and Maddie's Banana Stand LLC. But yeah, the business is going to be liable here. I'm not going to lose my house because John got a little sugared up and distracted. Okay, so the last thing is that if you have an LLC, you need an operating agreement. If you are a single member LLC, your operating agreement is really flexible because it's an agreement you're making with yourself. But if you have more than one member, if you have a business partner, you need an operating agreement and you need a well-drafted operating agreement. There's a lot that you can do yourself here. This is one thing. Seek out legal counsel. Get a lawyer to draft this because they know the pitfalls. They know what's going to come up in terms of third-party contracts. They know what's going to come up. We want you to think of this as a prenup for your business. You go into business, everyone's happy. We're starting our business, we're commingling our funds. John and I are really good friends. I like John a lot. What happens if in 5 years I don't like John so much? Well, if I have a well-drafted operating agreement, we can figure it out. We can figure out, we're gonna have those hard conversations up front. What if someone wants out? How do we bring in new people? How do we take investment money? What happens if the business needs money? Are we required to contribute additional money? Who can take out debt? Who can make decisions? We don't want to rely on handshake agreements. They're not going to keep you covered. So this just covers the most important information about governing your business. They can always be amended, but having a really strong foundational document is going to really help as you get into those difficult conversations. Hopefully you can put it in a drawer and never look at it again. But again, challenges come up and you want to be covered.
Thanks, Maddie. Yeah, I cannot stress the importance of having a well-drafted operating agreement at the beginning of starting your LLC and understanding the base level of what you and your business partner are able to do. Setting those ground rules sets you up for success. I cannot tell you how many instances we've dealt with that go to litigation where two members don't have a strong operating agreement, the company falls apart for one reason or another, and then they're kind of at each other's throats, or even if the company is successful. So definitely think about that and seek out legal counsel on that operating agreement, and totally reflect what Maddie said as well. Form your own LLC, get your own EIN if you feel comfortable doing it. You don't need to pay somebody hundreds of dollars an hour to do that, but on an operating agreement, definitely consider hiring an expert for that sort of portion. I'm going to talk about corporations. Many of you guys have probably heard of corporations. They're, I would call them kind of like the older sibling of LLCs. LLCs are actually newer than corporations. This is what most of the businesses that you guys know and think of are formed as the bigger businesses. They require significantly greater organizational documents. So Maddie walked through what the articles of organization look like for an LLC. You literally just go to that website. It's going to ask you questions, and it's going to generate your articles by themselves. For a corporation, I wouldn't recommend doing that. The articles of organization need to designate how many shares you have, the classes of shares, and the rights that are associated with those shares. So if you go in and you just do it willy-nilly on the Colorado Secretary of State website, you're going to end up with a finite number of common shares. You're almost certainly going to have to change that at a later date. So thinking about what your pathway, what your trajectory looks like, whether you're going to raise funds, whether you're going to have employee equity at the onset of forming your corporation is going to set you up for success in a way that just forming kind of blindly is going to create some problems. So in a corporation, you're going to have these articles of incorporation, which I just mentioned. You're going to have bylaws, which kind of are the governing documents of how things are run. You'll have a shareholder agreement for everybody who's coming in and putting money in or receiving equity. All of this stuff will be more or less publicly available. So I could go on the Secretary of State website right now, look up a corporation, and see what their share classes are, what the rights are associated with those share classes. And that's pretty critical because that encourages investor confidence. In an LLC, if I don't read the operating agreement, I don't know what the rules of the game are. The individuals who are running that LLC could issue a bunch more units and dilute me without me knowing it. Just depending on what that says. So investors who are investing in LLCs typically have to do a lot more diligence to understand what that operating agreement says, whereas in a corporation, there are statutory protections that all corporations have to abide by that protect investors. Therefore, investors are typically more comfortable investing in corporations. Not always the case. One thing I should add here, too, is that many companies start off as LLCs, and then as they grow, they convert into a corporation. An LLC, as Maddie mentioned, is much more flexible. You just have this operating agreement. You can adjust it pretty readily, pretty easily, kind of figure out the rules of the game. And then when you're ready to go out and raise institutional capital or get serious financing, you convert to a corporation. That is a typical kind of roadway, pathway, something like that, outlay for a company to go through. But if you know at the onset, hey, we're going to be raising institutional capital, we're seeking VC money, we're seeking private equity money, or for some of the tax reasons we'll go through later, it would make sense to start as a corporation. Corporations are owned by shareholders. Shareholders vote for board of directors. The board of directors oversees the C-suite. And that's kind of a broad, higher level sort of overview. But point being that shareholders have these rights that are codified. You know that every year you're going to get to vote for a director, and that director has a fiduciary duty to represent your interests in the company and oversee the board of directors. So I literally, right before this, came from about a 3-hour board of director meeting this morning where we were talking about the finances of the company. We're talking about, what is the best outlay moving forward, any potential litigation facing the company, any conflicted transactions. So there's these checks and balances, once again, statutory requirements that make investors more comfortable. Corporations, however, are not particularly tax efficient. So Maddie mentioned briefly that LLCs have pass-through taxation. So if Maddie and I are running our banana stand makes $10 in profit. That profit is imputed to Maddie and I whether or not we distribute that money from the LLC. So we have our LLC bank account set up. There's $10 in it. Maddie and I own the company 50-50. Maddie and I are each going to have a $5 tax burden to pay whether or not the LLC distributes money. And that results in what's called phantom income. So now I have a tax burden to pay for some money that I didn't receive. Many LLCs will then therefore make a tax distribution so you can cover that burden. In a corporation, particularly a C corporation, and we'll talk about different elections you can make, that's not the case. That $10 would be taxed at the corporate level. Now, Maddie and I don't actually have to pay anything, and the corporate tax level is lower typically than the personal income level. But if we took that money out of the corporation, so now Maddie and I each get $5, we wouldn't actually get $5 because the $10 was taxed, now it's $8, Maddie and I each get $4, and then we pay tax again on our personal income, so really at the end of the day we get $3 each. So that double taxation can be disadvantageous in certain circumstances. So depending on what kind of company you're setting up, depending on what your long-term intention is, if you're gonna run a lifestyle business where you're paying out distributions to yourself regularly, you probably don't want a corporation. You don't want to get taxed twice. If you're starting a big business where you're not going to make distributions and your goal is eventually to exit, maybe you do want to be a corporation. So being really intentional about what you're setting up at the onset can kind of ensure success. Last thing to mention on this slide, limited personal liability is certainly important. Both LLCs and corporations offer the same insulation from personal liability, but both require, once again, that you're abiding by those corporate formalities, the most important of which is that you're not commingling funds. Don't buy your personal stuff on your company bank account. Don't buy your company stuff with your personal bank account unless you're documenting and reimbursing for that. So if you're running an LLC and you want to pay yourself, that's fine. You need to. But don't have the individual make the check out to you, your client make the check out to you, make it out to your company, and then pay yourself from your company. So there's this beautiful paper trail of everything's insulated, everything's clean. So, we talked about corporations and LLCs. Which one's right for you? Well, that's a very, very fact-dependent case question. So, LLCs, easier to create. All you need to do is file this Articles of Organization. Up until very recently, it was $1 to do so in Colorado. Now I think it's $50 again. But it's super easy. And honestly, I have heart palpitations anytime somebody tells me oh, I'm a small business, I don't need a company. Absolutely not. We work with a lot of graphic designers. Maddie brought that up. I mean, you accidentally pull one image that's not yours, you can lose your house, and if you have an LLC, you have that liability protection. So LLC is easier to create. Corporations are a little bit harder and more involved because in that certificate of incorporation or articles of incorporation, depending on what state you're filing in, same thing, different name, you have to specify those shares. And to amend the certificate of incorporation, this is critical, you need shareholder approval. So if I want to authorize the company to be able to issue more shares and dilute my investors, the investors have to approve my doing that. Once again, another reason why investors are comfortable or more comfortable putting money into corporations. Governance. An LLC can be pretty free and easy. You put what you want to do into the operating agreement. You can waive fiduciary duties. You can compete with your own LLC. All sorts of things you can do. Once again, doesn't inspire investor confidence, but very much allows for flexibility, allows you to get off the ground. You don't have to have a board of directors. You don't have to have board meetings. You don't have to have shareholder votes. Very quick and easy. On the governance side of a corporation, you have to have a board of directors. That board of directors has to be elected by the shareholders. You have to have meetings every year of the shareholders to elect the board of directors. Now, practically speaking, many of those meetings happen by a piece of paper that gets sent out to everybody that says, I waive the right to a meeting and I'm voting for Maddie as director. But you have to do that. So a lot more kind of heavy lift going on. And as a result, when you're seeking outside capital, LLCs, less attractive to investors. Certainly not a bar. We've worked with clients who've raised millions of dollars into LLCs. But there are certain funds that will not interact. And that's the first thing, And I think when you're looking for private equity or venture capital, one of the entrepreneurs I worked with, who's a big tech entrepreneur, said to me, if you're explaining, you're losing. So if somebody asks you, why are you an LLC, you're investing that capital that you otherwise could be talking about your business plan to say like, well, my partner and I decided that was the easiest thing to do and just filed it on the Colorado Secretary of State website. Not the greatest answer. So outside capital, easier to raise in a corporation, not necessarily a bar in an LLC, but because of the statutory protections, corporations are easier for that purpose. Employee compensation. This is something I haven't really touched on much at all. Everybody talks about employee equity. Candidly, I think it's a little bit overrated, but that's a whole nother conversation. In an LLC, it is much harder to issue employees equity. When somebody is an employee, they receive a W-2. When somebody is an owner, they receive a K-1 for tax reporting purposes. As a traditional partnership, technically you cannot be a W-2 and a K-1 of the same LLC under IRS guidelines. Some CPAs are like, we don't really care about that. Others absolutely will not let you do it. Kind of depends on their risk tolerance. It's not impossible to issue employee equity in an LLC. There's a lot of traction around like phantom shares or profit shares, which aren't real ownership, but you see that a lot more, but it's much more complex. In a C Corp, you have a ton of flexibility for employee equity. You can have an employee equity pool that's reserved. Their W-2s, they also receive their shares. That's any dividends that are issued based on those shares are reported on a 1099 div, so you can have somebody receiving a 1099 and a W-2. There's no problems there. A lot more flexibility for issuing employee equity in a corporation. So once again, as you're thinking through your foundation of your company, are you gonna have a ton of employees? Do you want them to have equity? What does that look like? Pretty critical to kind of think through that as well. And then lastly, we talked through tax considerations a little bit. I'm gonna go deeper on that on the next slide, but LLC has pass-through taxation, which can be good because you're only getting taxed one time. It also can be bad if you're not gonna make any distributions and you have this phantom income that you have to pay taxes on every year when you're never actually recognizing any gain from it. Corporations have double tax, and then this is the caveat here, which I'll talk about in a second, unless an S election is made. Also, though, we should consider qualified small business stock, which is kind of all the rage for tech-type companies and other types of companies. And if your goal is to build a company that you're going to exit from and not issue distributions, that can be a very attractive tax incentive. So, tax elections. An LLC by default is taxed as a partnership that has pass-through income that is reported on a K-1. Employee equity I already mentioned. There's no K-1 and W-2. You can't be both of those things. So employee owners don't really exist in a formal partnership. And then I mentioned OFAC SDN list. That just basically means you need to make sure that people investing in your company aren't foreign national terrorist type folks who are banned from investing in U.S. companies. Qualified small business stock, no, it is not eligible for that. An S corporation literally stands for small shareholder. So you can be an LLC that is taxed as an S corporation. A lot of CPAs will encourage you to be an S corporation. I would discourage that. You can get all the tax benefit of being an S corporation while you're still an LLC and you don't have all those statutory requirements like having shareholders meetings and electing boards of directors and those sorts of things. An S corporation has pass-through income like a partnership, so it's only taxed once, but it also enables you to be a K-1 and a W-2. So you could have employee owners. Caveat here, you can only have one class of shares. So typically, in a traditional employee equity program, you might have non-voting shares, or you might have shares that have no liquidation preference or no distribution preference, meaning that they're going to get paid out later to the employees. Investors like that because they want to get their money back first. In an S corporation, you can't do that. You can't have different distribution provisions. You can only have one class of shares. You can have non-voting shares in an S corporation, but other kind of restrictions, you can only have 100 shareholders. You can't have any entity shareholders. So if somebody wants to put together an SPV to invest in your company, you can't be an S corporation. And there's no foreign shareholders. So this is a really good election to make if you're going to be an LLC that wants to regularly distribute money to the owners. Because what the owners will do is they'll take a portion of that pay as W-2 salary, and that'll be taxed this rate, and a portion of that distribution at a lower taxable rate. So it mitigates a bunch of the tax burden for folks who are running small businesses. Lastly, C Corp. C Corp has the double taxation provision that I talked about. It's going to be taxed at the corporate level. It's also going to be taxed when you distribute. So that's tax disadvantageous. But for employee equity, you can have multiple classes of shares. You can incentivize people in any number of ways. There's an incredible amount of flexibility there. You also don't have any restrictions on the types of investors. You can have as many investors as you want. They can be entities. They can be foreign nationals. As long as they're not on that OFAC SDN list, they're not foreign national, essentially terrorists, then they're good to go. Lastly, C Corps are eligible for qualified small business stock. And this is kind of its own beast. And qualified small business stock is eligible for C corporations that have a value of gross assets at original cost that do not exceed $50 million at the time of issuance. Need to be issued directly from the corporation. There is a criteria for being eligible for qualified small business stock that is actually listed in the IRS code in the negative. So the ones that are not eligible are hospitality, personal services like legal services are not eligible for qualified small business stock. Financial, farming, real estate. There are ways to kind of finesse your company away from those definitions if you do some of this stuff and into more allowable categories, I guess I'd say. But the benefit of this is that if you hold this stock for 5 years and then the company exits, you get paid on that stock with 0% federal income or federal tax. So, I mean, that's like a 30%, 40% savings in tax rate. So when you're forming your company, if you're thinking, we're not going to issue distributions, we're going to build this tech company, we're going to build the next Twitter, X, whatever we want to call it, and then we're going to sell it 5 years from now, 10 years from now. This can be an incredibly attractive investment strategy and also can attract investors because they'll participate in the same tax benefit. So thinking at the onset of your company, what are my goals? Is this a small company that I'm going to pay myself distributions from? Well, then maybe you're an LLC, taxed as an S corporation. Am I growing this company, issuing a ton of employee equity, hoping to exit in 10 years for some huge multiple? Then you might want to be a C corporation and try to get this QSBS treatment. I'm going to pass it to Maddie real quick to talk about the newest piece of legislation.
Thanks, John. So the Corporate Transparency Act. Corporate Transparency Act is coming into effect in January of next year, January 1st, 2024. All entities, corporations, LLCs, are going to be required to report their beneficial ownership and keep that information updated with FinCEN. Beneficial owners, anyone who owns or controls more than 25% of an entity or exercises substantial control of an entity. That definition is incredibly nuanced. We don't have time to get into it today, but it is something to be aware of. There are fines and potential criminal liability for failure to comply. So this is really, really important. If you form your company after January 1st of 2024, you'll have 30 days from the date of formation to file this information with FinCEN. If you form before January 1st, 2024, you have 1 year to file with FinCEN. If you do not currently have an entity and are considering starting an entity, which you certainly should be after today, please form your entities before January 1st so that you can give yourself some additional time, an additional buffer to file your information with FinCEN. And the really important thing here is that anytime there's a change in your information, so anytime a beneficial owner moves, anytime there's a new beneficial owner, anytime a beneficial owner sells, all of that information does have to be updated with FinCEN within 30 days. And again, this is where those potential fines and criminal liability for failure to comply kick in. There's a lot more to come on the Corporate Transparency Act. We're all still kind of figuring out what it's going to look like, what enforcement will look like, what filing is going to look like. The regulations have been slow to come down. The information has been slow to come down, but it is something to keep an eye on. Get in touch with legal counsel for more information as we get closer. Okay, so as John mentioned, he and I used to be teachers. We set out our goal at the beginning of this chat that you would all be able to identify certain things. So we brought some hats, some swag. We're going to take volunteers to answer these questions, make sure we met the criteria that we set out for ourselves. So anyone want to volunteer why it's important to have an entity? Sure, Seth.
Because it separates you and your business for liability from like losing your house, your retirement, any other savings you want to have that's outside of your business.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, where do you go to form an entity? Sure. Secretary of State's website, correct. What do you need to do to preserve your liability protection?
Your finances are accepted.
Okay, finances, very, very separate. That's a great answer. That's the number one thing we want you to do. All right, what 3 tax structures did we broadly discuss? This is a hard one. Taxes are complicated.
Sole proprietorships, partnerships, and corporations.
That's close. Those are all entity types. Those are not the different tax types, though.
Was it partnership, S corp, C corp? No.
Yeah.
Nailed it. Nice job.
Partnerships, S corporations, and C corporations. Which tax structure, so again, from those 3 partnerships, S corporations, and C corporations, which of those is potentially eligible for QSBS, qualified small business stock? C corps. Good. Okay, and the last one. When does the corporate transparency go into effect and who needs to file? Yeah.
January 2024, all entities.
Correct. Okay, John, looks like we actually met our goal and everyone was able to. Ooh, that was a really good high five. Okay, now we are a little over, but our firm is giving the next presentation, so we have a little bit of time for questions.
So if you have an LLC, but you have, so I have an LLC, I have offshoots of other businesses that are sort of popping up. Is it better to form additional LLCs? Is it better to have divisions of and keep it under one umbrella? Is it, I just don't, like, how's the, not necessarily growing up to corporate, but is it
Yeah.
multiple LLCs or one LLC that does more than one thing?
Good question. I guess it sort of depends on the relatedness of how they're operating, but generally I would recommend having multiple LLCs. You can have one LLC that owns the other 2 LLCs, but for example, we represent a company that has a number of different restaurant locations. Every restaurant location is held in its separate LLC because if somebody walks into that one on Broadway and slips and falls, then they can't take the interests or the equity or, assets of another location. So, I would err on the side of having multiple LLCs. What you can do too to simplify that is have a parent holding company that then holds these separate interests, but each one needs to have, once again, its own. Yeah, and what do you need with the EIN, and bank account?
Yeah.
An LLC can be a parent company.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And if it's a single member LLC, meaning there's only one owner, for tax purposes, it will be disregarded. So the income just flows up to that parent LLC, and then you can only issue K-1s from the parent LLC. So it's, for liability purposes, it's multiple companies. For tax purposes, it's one company. Good question. Thank you. Seth.
So you talked about the different types, being able to have different types of investors. How does that relate to filing with the SEC for the investors, given that they are not in control of what they're doing with the money? You are. They might have some say, I guess.
So there's sort of 2 different issues to talk about there. One is the Corporate Transparency Act. So if you have a certain amount of control, which I can't remember off the top of my head right now, 25%, you will need to file. So if somebody comes and invests and takes more than 25% of your company, you need to update and say, Seth just bought 25% of the banana stand and, we're good to go. In terms of other filings, Depending on the financial raise that you're participating in, you likely need to file what's called Form D with the SEC, which is an exemption from filing a full-on prospectus. That you don't need to file the individual names of the investors, though, so wouldn't affect that.
I know a little bit about 506B and 506C.
Yeah.
Wasn't really sure how that played into it, or if it was that, or if that was something separate.
Related, but not exactly spot on unless it gets into that Corporate Transparency Act where you're conveying more than 25% of the company. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
I guess my question is like twofold. Can you have an LLC in the US in another country? And then if so, what are the tax implications for that?
That is a difficult question. It really depends on the country. We do a lot of work with companies that operate both in the UK and the US, and they typically have a private limited company, an LTD in the UK. You file that through Companies House. Everything is much more publicly available in the UK, like directors' addresses and stuff. It's kind of wild. But a lot of times what we'll have is a US company that holds that LTD, so they own the British company, and then they'll own a subsidiary in the United States as well. In terms of tax implications, it's really kind of jurisdiction specific. Yeah.
But would you register here first, or would you register in the foreign country? Like, because I don't have an LLC yet, and I'm thinking between waiting until I move to my other country first to do it, but I'll be serving clients in the US.
Interesting question. I mean, if you're starting to bring on clients, I'd probably form the LLC in the United States. If your clients are going to be in the United States, I mean, if you're going to get sued, it would be an odd situation because if you had a foreign LLC, you're probably still going to get sued in the United States. And then you're going to have the judges applying foreign law. I would probably recommend the United States, but we can go down the rabbit hole on that if you want to.
Okay, cool.
My plan right now is to form LLC and then later transfer to C Corp. But my mentor is telling me that it's better to do like LLC than transfer to S Corp. But I just think like a C Corp will be very complicated to operate. And also, however, my business idea, if it becomes successful, needs a lot of investment. So what's the best strategy?
Yeah, good question. I think that I don't see a lot of situations where somebody should form as an S corporation because you can be an LLC that elects to be taxed as an S corporation. So the benefit of that S corporation is the flexible taxation structure. But the drawback, if you form as an S corporation, is that you still have to do all the corporate formalities. You have to have shareholders meetings and all the other things. As an LLC, you don't. So I would say, I mean, for longer term, if you're taking on investment, being a corporation is going to probably be easier, especially if it requires a lot of investment. In the short term, starting as an LLC is not a bad idea. I would say I would not recommend starting as an S corporation because you're kind of straddling the fence. You get the drawback of being a big corporation without the need to be a big corporation, I guess I'd say.
From LLC to C Corp, will be like that easy to do, to sell or to transfer? What's the way forward?
Yeah, it's relatively easy. It depends on what state you're registered in. So we've done a lot in Delaware or where a company converts into Delaware. Oftentimes it coincides with a raise. So you say basically at the time of this fundraise, when the money comes in, we're going to convert to a C corporation and here's kind of the parameters of it. You file a plan of conversion, you get your investors to sign off on it, you file away, and you're converted.
Thanks for your presentation. Very great information. Appreciate it. On the LLC partnership, are there predefined roles you have to have that the LLC requires, like managing member or regular member, or can you just rely on your operating agreement to define all that stuff?
Good question. You can rely on your operating agreement. So in a corporation, there are statutorily defined positions depending on state. You might need to have a president, secretary, treasurer. And I worked with a dairy company that was an LLC, and they had a CIEIO. So you can make anything you want. Yeah.
But if your operating agreement doesn't address it, there's probably some default that falls through for.
So, because LLCs are creatures of agreement, right? It's whatever you agree to do. So, what you'll often see in an operating agreement is that the managers have the right to appoint directors or officers at will. So, if you say are both a member and a manager of your LLC, you decide to bring in outside individuals to serve as officers, you can just say, we're going to name a CEO, a secretary, a treasurer, whatever. It's very, very flexible, and it's kind of at the will of the managers.
And then just one last thing, real quick, sorry. Did the LLP entity die? Because I used to see that all over the place, and I never
Yeah.
heard anyone talking about it anymore. Just curious.
So the LP entity is largely phasing out, and you still hear people talk about like GPs and LPs, but usually they're doing it through LLCs. So the concept being that the GP is the fund manager, the LP is kind of the passive investor. So really the GP is kind of like the manager and member, and the LP is just a member. But I don't see too many LPs anymore. Why is that? An LLC provides greater liability protection. And flexibility, yeah. LLCs are relatively new. I think they probably started about 20 years ago. So it took a little bit for people to get comfortable with them and investing in them, and it's just kind of what we see more now. Something like that. Maybe a little
They maybe
longer.
started in the 90s, but they haven't been around nearly
years
as
ago.
long as the idea of a partnership, a limited partnership or a corporation, because they were just not a thing, and then someone decided they were.
How hard is it if you start an LLC, just like you're the person, and then you take on a partner? How hard is it? Can you just ask a partnership and documents, or you have how hard is it to get?
Good question. It's really easy. With the caveat that if you go from a single member to a multi-member LLC, you need an operating agreement that's going to govern those rules. But once you have a multi-member LLC, a lot of times they'll contemplate bringing on additional members, how that happens. And a lot of times it's as easy as just adjusting Exhibit A, which is the ownership percentages and the capital contributions.
One caveat to that so you don't have to file anything new with like the Secretary of State, but once the Corporate Transparency Act kicks in, if you are adding new members who either have substantial control or 25% beneficial ownership, those individuals will need to be reported.
Is there a process wherein you can go back to an earlier entity, like normally you see transfers happening from ESCOM to SECO, if I'm not mistaken. But is there a reverse process, and if yes, what are the instances that you have seen where this can happen?
Good question. So yeah, a lot of times businesses will start as an LLC and then become a C Corp. It is less common that you see a company go from C Corp to LLC. It's possible. You need when you're dealing with the C Corp, there's a lot of paperwork going out to shareholders relatively frequently that they have to sign. And every time that you send a bunch of paperwork to shareholders, you have about 1 million questions. And so it becomes very cumbersome. Because the LLC structure is much more flexible, in that operating agreement, you can literally say the managers reserve the right to convert the company to a corporation at a later date. And then when the money comes in, everybody's already agreed to that provision in the operating agreement. So there's no statutory provision requiring you to go out and get consent again. Whereas going from a C Corp to an LLC, you would need that consent. So you don't see C Corp to LLC as often. LLC to C Corp, you do see. S Corp is a tax election. You can blow that tax election. People do it unintentionally all the time. You create 2 classes of shares. Your CPA doesn't know that. They're still filing as an S corporation. And then eventually you end up having to pay a tax penalty and do what's called an F reorganization, which is a giant pain. So try to avoid that.
If I file as an LLC,
Can I write off my mortgage interest? Like, that's one of the things with like forming a business is, especially like tax and stuff on my mortgage got like went up, or my condo. So that was one of my things of like going, like, do I file an LLC or do I not? Cause I wanna like write off like the interest on my mortgage and stuff.
Are you using it as a home office? Well, I'm going to tell you the classic lawyer answer here, which is check with your CPA. But yeah, I don't want to I don't want to be on video saying something wrong here. Yeah, talk to your CPA, but there's a good chance. Cool. Well, really appreciate all the really great questions. I will put some cards up there for anybody who wants to get in touch with us. And oh, I didn't do the end. Thank you. There's our email addresses. We'll also post our slides on our website. And then I think I was supposed to thank some sponsors, but I might have lost that slide. So thank you to all the sponsors.